Mastering the Noise. A love story bound by power and sacrifice. What if love wasn't something we found in each other's eyes, but something that arrived from a place so far beyond our reach, that it tore apart everything we thought we knew about ourselves? Could you love a being from another world? Or would the gap between us be so vast, so impossible to cross, that it would destroy everything? Imagine this, a message. Not from a friend. Not from anyone you know. It came from somewhere unimaginable. Somewhere that could change everything you thought was real. And just like that, everything I knew was shattered. The message was simple. Help me. But there was one problem: it wasn't from Earth. This story isn't about your typical love story. This isn't some innocent romance or easy connection. This is about a love that transcends every rule, every boundary, every law of nature itself. But what if this love wasn't meant to be? What if this was just a cruel game played by the universe, testing whether humanity could survive the weight of the unknown? Could you sacrifice everything for love, even when you realize that the price is higher than you could have ever imagined? Every decision I made brought me closer to a reality where love wasn't just a feeling, it was a force. And that force could destroy us both. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you believe about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Watch till the end to uncover the hidden truths that will leave you speechless. Remember, this is not your typical love story, this is an intergalactic journey. Subscribe, comment below, and join us on this wild ride into the unknown. You won't want to miss us. The winds of the Echo Desert whispered through the barren landscape, carrying with it the suffocating silence of Raziel. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. There was a sense of stillness that permeated everything, as though time itself had been caught in a moment of hesitation. Kale Drace stood still, his broad shoulders rising and falling with every measured breath. He had become accustomed to the noise, the constant torrent of thoughts that flooded his mind, the chaotic symphony of others' desires, fears, and anger. But today was different. For the first time in years, there was something quiet. A pulse of faint whisper amidst the cacophony. A voice that cut through the noise like a blade. Save me, save me. The voice wasn't his own. It wasn't even human. It was clear, pure, like the sound of wind through crystal, and it echoed deep within Kale's mind. The moment he heard it, his heart raced. He could feel it, a deep resonance, something far beyond the reach of his usual thoughts. He squinted against the desert sun and felt the weight of the desert's silence press against his chest. The whisper grew louder, clearer, calling him, pleading. But who? There was no time for hesitation. Kale's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he began to walk, every step a rhythm of determination. His mind, usually overwhelmed with the chaos of the noise, now focused entirely on the source of this strange, compelling voice. He moved through the desert, the cinder-like sand swirling around him in the wake of his boots. He wasn't sure how he knew where he was going. There were no signs, no markers. Only the faint pull of the voice guiding him, tugging at his very soul. And then, there it was. The ground beneath his feet shifted. The sound of the desert seemed to fade into nothingness. The air became thick, almost solid, as if he had crossed an invisible threshold. In front of him stood a shimmering veil, a strange field of energy, pulsating with life, but alien. The noise he had lived with for so long was gone here. Instead, there was an eerie calm, and an overwhelming sense that something or someone was waiting. Kale stopped, his breath steady as his eyes searched the space in front of him. The voice, he could still hear it, like a thread of thought he couldn't quite catch. He reached out, his fingers grazing the invisible barrier. The moment his skin touched it, he felt the world shift. A figure began to form within the shimmering veil. It was at first a blur, indistinct. But then, it became clearer, more solid. A woman. Her skin was a soft, glowing emerald green, her eyes huge and luminous glistened with a vibrant, violet hue that seemed to pulse with energy. Her long, platinum white hair floated around her like a halo, glowing faintly in the air. Her pointed ears twitched slightly as if sensing his presence. The moment their gazes met, Kale felt a jolt, a shock wave through his body. His heart skipped. He didn't understand it, but he felt it. It was a connection he couldn't explain. This wasn't just a strange encounter. This was something else. Her lips moved, but no words came. The connection between them was more than just words. Her thoughts, they reverberated through his mind, more powerful than any voice. "Please, save me." Her voice was like a whisper, but it felt as if it had been screamed directly into his soul. Kale's pulse quickened. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew this was no coincidence. She was in trouble. She needed him. And somehow, he had already been drawn to her. He could feel it. A pull, almost magnetic, calling him toward her. Every part of him, his senses, his instincts screamed to act. But even as he moved closer, his thoughts raced with uncertainty. How could he save someone like her? A being from another world? From a place where noise didn't even exist? Her form flickered in and out of his vision, growing more solid with every passing moment. And in that fleeting, yet eternal moment, Kale knew. There was no turning back. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but Kale didn't stop. Every step felt like a countdown, each second bringing them closer to an uncertain future. Elora walked beside him, her presence at once calming and unsettling. She was more than just a companion now. She was a force, a mind intertwined with his. Kale could feel it. The resonance between them wasn't just physical anymore. It was more. Her thoughts and his were beginning to merge. Her emotions echoed in his chest, her fears, her hopes, now felt as vivid as his own. But with every passing hour, he could feel something else too. The noise was returning, seeping into the corners of his mind, creeping back in with deafening intensity. It wasn't the dissonant, chaotic roar of the past. It was a deeper, more focused hum, like a presence lurking just beyond his consciousness. "You're feeling it, too, aren't you?" Elora's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but clear. Kale glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "Yeah," he replied, his voice tight. "Something's changing." They continued their trek, moving away from the remnants of the battlefield. The noise wasn't just an enemy now. It was a companion. Kale had learned to use it as a weapon, but he knew it could just as easily consume him. The two of them reached the outskirts of the Mind Veil Temple, a place Kale had heard whispers of in the few scraps of intel he had managed to gather. It was a place of ancient power, where the noise could be controlled, manipulated even, by those who truly understood its depths. Illyra was more than just curious about it. She was desperate. This is where I can learn to control it, control the Echo Core. Her words hung in the air between them. Kale could feel her resolve harden, but also a flicker of doubt. She wasn't just learning to control the noise for herself. She was learning to control it for them. For the universe. They entered the temple, and the air inside felt heavy, thick with power. The walls were adorned with ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time, but their influence still palpable. Illyra's hand traced the markings on the stone as she walked, a soft hum reverberating in the air as if the temple itself was alive. "How do you feel?" Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Illyra stopped, her eyes closed for a moment. "I feel like I've finally come home." Kale didn't understand. Home. The noise, the chaos, the uncertainty, they were all the opposite of home. But when he looked at her, he saw something he couldn't ignore. Illyra was changing. She wasn't just learning to fight the noise. She was learning to live with it, to become one with it. Before Kale could respond, the walls of the temple began to hum in response to their presence. A deep vibration thrummed beneath their feet, growing in intensity. "Get down!" Kale shouted, instinctively pulling Illyra toward the ground. A massive energy blast erupted from the temple's central core, lighting up the darkened space. The shock wave knocked them off their feet, and the once solid walls seemed to pulse with an angry light. Illyra gasped, her hands raised as if to shield them both, but the blast didn't stop. Kale looked at her. This was the noise. The Echo Core was reacting to them, to the resonance between their minds. "We have to stabilize it," Illyra said urgently, her voice trembling. "I need to connect with it fully." Kale gritted his teeth. How? He was ready for anything, but he wasn't sure how they could survive this. "Trust me," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. And in that moment, Kale felt something he hadn't expected: trust. Illyra wasn't just asking for his help. She was asking him to believe in her. With a single nod, Kale stepped back. He could feel the energy crackling around them. It wasn't just raw power. It was the tension between their minds, their connection, pulling them both into the heart of the noise. Illyra reached out with both hands, her fingers brushing the ancient symbols on the temple walls. She closed her eyes, and the hum of the noise seemed to dissipate. It was as if she was absorbing the vibrations, calming them, aligning them with her own thoughts. The noise around them became calm, almost serene. It was as though the resonance of their minds had blended with the very core of the temple. The oppressive tension began to melt away, leaving only the quiet, steady rhythm of their combined presence. Kale watched, awestruck, as Illyra's form seemed to glow, her violet eyes brighter than ever before. She had mastered it, at least, for now. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and relief. Her hand fell to her side, and the temple's hum faded into the distance. But Kale knew this wasn't over. The noise was still there, somewhere, lurking. The battle was just beginning, and the answers they sought lay ahead. Still, for the first time, Kale felt like they had a chance. The temple was eerily quiet now. The hum of the noise, which had once felt suffocating, had finally ceased. Kale stood beside Elora, still feeling the tremors of their combined resonance reverberate through his chest. It wasn't just the power that they had unlocked, it was the connection. Elora's hand brushed lightly against his arm, a simple touch that sent a jolt of warmth through Kale's body. It was as if her touch held a quiet power, gentle, yet overwhelming. Kale's heart skipped a beat. He had never felt anything like it before, not even in the midst of the chaos. "You did it, Elora," Kale said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes locked onto hers, watching the way the violet light in her eyes seemed to flicker in the stillness. For a brief moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Elora turned to face him fully, her gaze searching his with an intensity that made Kale's breath catch. Her violet eyes weren't just a reflection of the noise anymore. They had become something more alive, aware. "Kale," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. For a moment, the words hung in the air between them. But her thoughts, her emotions spoke louder than words ever could. She didn't need to say anything. He could feel it. The tension between them was palpable, and yet, there was an overwhelming sense of calm. Kale had always been a fighter, always relying on his strength and resilience to get through the toughest of battles. But now, with Elora standing before him, he realized that there was a different kind of power, a vulnerability that he had never experienced before. Without thinking, he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was cool to the touch, but it sent a wave of warmth through his fingertips, as if he could feel her heartbeat beneath the surface. For a moment, they stood there, the world around them forgotten. Their minds, once chaotic and separate, were now intertwined in a way that neither of them could have predicted. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was something deeper, something raw, something real. Elora's breath hitched slightly, and Kale could feel the tension in her body, the way her muscles tightened in response to his touch. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Instead, her thoughts poured into him, filling the space between them. "I never thought I would feel this again," she thought, her voice soft, but undeniable. "I never thought I could feel safe." Kale's heart ached. He could feel the weight of her emotions, the way she had carried the burden of loneliness for so long. And now, as her thoughts wrapped around his own, he knew he was her anchor. But in that moment, he also realized something more. She was his anchor, too. Before he could say anything, Elora leaned into him, her forehead gently resting against his chest. Her breath was slow, steady, but there was a shuddering quality to it that told Kale everything he needed to know. She was vulnerable. She was fragile, and yet, she was also stronger than anything he had ever known. Kale closed his eyes, his hands still resting on her face, his thumb brushing lightly across her cheek. Her skin was cool, but there was a heat rising between them, a quiet fire that neither of them could ignore. As his fingers traced the outline of her jaw, Elara's breath deepened, a soft sigh escaping her lips. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes now full of something new, a silent understanding. "Kale." Her voice faltered, but the connection between them told him everything he needed to know. She didn't have to say anything. He could feel her in every breath, in every beat of his heart. And then, as if the world had finally aligned, Kale leaned in. The kiss was slow, tentative at first. But as their lips met, something shifted. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the culmination of everything they had been through, everything they had shared. A shared silence, a shared understanding, and a shared power. Elara's hands found their way to his chest, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his armor. Her touch was light, almost delicate, but the warmth of her hands burned through him, igniting a spark deep within his core. He could feel the resonance between them intensifying, the connection growing stronger with every second. And just as quickly as it had started, they pulled apart, both breathless. Kale's forehead rested gently against hers, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've never felt anything like that," Kale murmured, his voice rough, the words thick with emotion. He didn't know what to say. He didn't have to. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the silence between them, the understanding, the bond that had been forged in the depths of the noise. Elara nodded, her eyes soft, but filled with a quiet strength. "I feel it, too," she whispered. And Kale could hear it in her thoughts. She was not alone. But the quiet didn't last long. A distant rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the noise began to shift once again. They had only just begun to understand their powers. But the world outside them was still a battlefield, one that they couldn't escape. Part 6, The Power of the Mind. The rumble beneath their feet grew louder. Kale could feel the earth trembling, the very ground beneath them shifting as if the planet itself was reacting to something powerful, something terrifying. Elara stiffened beside him, her mind suddenly flooded with images, distorted thoughts, and echoes of past failures. "We need to move," Kale said urgently, grabbing Elara's arm and pulling her toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the temple. Her mind was disoriented, clouded by the force of the noise. He could feel it, her thoughts were swirling, entangled with his, as if the noise was amplifying their emotions, their fears. "It's coming," Elara whispered, her voice strained, as she looked over her shoulder. Kale didn't need to ask who she meant. He could feel it too. The presence. There was no time to waste. Kale dragged Elara through the winding corridors of the Mind Veil Temple, his heart pounding in his chest, the pressure of the noise tightening around him like a vice. They had to find the heart of the temple, the echo core, where the noise was born, where it all began. As they rounded a corner, they saw it. The center of the temple, a vast chamber filled with a pulsating, intangible energy. It was like the air itself was alive, humming with the power of the noise. Kale could see it now. The source of everything, the echo core, an ancient machine of unimaginable power, glowing with an otherworldly light. Elara stopped, her breathing shallow. She could feel it too. The core called to her, resonated with her very being. It was as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting for her. She stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a strange intensity. "This is it, Kale." Elara's voice trembled with a mix of fear and determination. Her thoughts were chaotic, overwhelmed by the noise of the core, but she had to push through it. She had to understand it, control it. Kale watched her, feeling the intensity of her emotions, her desperation. He could feel it in his own mind. This was their final test. Could Elara truly control the noise? Could she master the power of the Echo Core and end the chaos that had consumed their world? The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Elara raised her hands, closing her eyes, and Kale stepped back, knowing what she was about to do. She was reaching out not with her body, but with her mind. At first, nothing happened. The core hummed, a deep, guttural sound, like the growl of a distant animal. Then, slowly, the resonance between them intensified. Elara's breath hitched as the power of the noise began to converge in the chamber. She was struggling to contain it, to bend it to her will. "Elara." Kale's voice was thick with concern. He could feel her straining, the pressure of the noise building. It was becoming too much. Her hands trembled, and her body swayed slightly, as if she might collapse under the weight of the mind-shattering power she was channeling. And then, a flash of light. A blinding pulse erupted from the core, and for a moment, everything was still. Kale could feel it, the force of her mind connecting with the core, binding it to her. She was in control for now. But the noise was alive. It would never be tamed so easily. Elara collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The resonance between them flickered, fading in and out like a dying flame. Kale rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. He could feel the exhaustion radiating from her. Her mind had been stretched to its limits. But she had done it. She had stopped the noise, at least for now. "Elara," Kale whispered, his hand gently brushing the strands of her white hair from her face. She looked up at him, her violet eyes wide and filled with a tenderness he hadn't expected. "I'm not sure how long I can hold it." Her voice was weak, but steady. "The core, it's too powerful. If I let go, it could destroy everything." Kale's hand rested on hers, grounding her, his mind a steady presence against the storm that still raged inside her. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together." She nodded, her gaze meeting his with a quiet understanding. They weren't just allies anymore. They were something more. But as they shared that brief moment of calm, the noise began to stir again. And from the shadows, the figure Kale had sensed earlier stepped forward, a new threat, one far more dangerous than any they had faced. The chamber fell into silence again, but it was a silence filled with tension. Elara still knelt beside the core, her body trembling with the effort to hold it at bay. Kale stood close, his body shielding her from whatever was coming. And it came. From the shadows, slow, deliberate footsteps. A figure cloaked in black stepped into the light, his face partially hidden behind a cracked metallic mask. But Kale knew that posture, that walk. His heart sank. "Thulrex," Kale whispered, his voice barely audible. He hadn't heard that name in years. The man stopped, lifting his gaze. Even through the mask, Kale could feel the weight of that stare. "You remember me," the figure said with a dry chuckle. "I suppose that's good. It means I left a mark." Kale's fists clenched. "You betrayed us. You sold us out to the resonance." "I survived," Thilrex corrected, stepping forward, the air around him rippling with unstable noise. "You call it betrayal. I call it evolution." Elora struggled to rise, her hand reaching for Kale's. Her thoughts were fractured, trying to process this new threat while keeping control of the core. But the presence of Thilrex, it was familiar to her, somehow. "You know him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kale nodded once. "We fought together. Before all this. Before the noise started warping our minds." "And you still don't understand," Thilrex said coldly. "You and I, Kale, we are what comes after. The next stage. The noise isn't a curse. It's the raw voice of creation." Kale took a step forward, placing himself fully between Thilrex and Elora. "You used to fight for something. Now you're just a weapon. You've lost yourself." Thilrex's laugh was hollow. "Lost? No. I've been remade." He lifted his hand, and the air between them shimmered violently. Kale's thoughts exploded with sound voices not his own, visions that didn't belong to him. He staggered back, gripping his head. The noise was different now. Thilrex wasn't just projecting his thoughts. He was infiltrating minds, bending them. "Don't fight me, Kale," Thilrex murmured. "Let me show you what true power feels like." Kale gritted his teeth, forcing the voices out. "I've seen your kind of power. It destroys." Elora stood now, barely holding her balance. But her eyes were burning with light. "He's feeding off chaos," she said. "That's why the core reacted. He's here to take control of it." "Very good, alien girl," Thilrex said with a smirk. "The core was built to answer to minds like mine. Minds unchained. Minds willing to go beyond fear." He raised his hand again, this time directing it toward Elora. Kale moved faster than he'd ever moved before. He slammed into Thilrex, sending them both crashing into the wall. The impact echoed through the chamber. For a moment, they were both still. Then, Thilrex began to laugh. "You don't get it," he rasped. "Every time you fight, you feed it. The noise grows stronger with every emotion, every desperate thought." He pushed Kale back, hard. Kale hit the stone floor, breath knocked from his lungs. Elora's voice pierced the air. "No more." She stepped forward, her eyes glowing so bright they lit the chamber in violet light. Her thoughts surged outward, not just into Kale's mind, but into Thilrex's. And for the first time, he recoiled. He stumbled. "You, what are you?" he hissed. Elora's presence filled the space. It wasn't anger. It wasn't violence. It was something else. Clarity. Thilrex's noise stuttered. The thoughts that had once flooded the room began to falter. Elora wasn't projecting chaos. She was projecting stillness. Kale pushed himself up, watching in awe. She wasn't fighting him. She was dismantling him one thought at a time. You chose noise as your god, Elora said, her voice clear and steady. But noise without balance is madness. Thilrex fell to one knee. Sweat dripped down his face. His hands trembled. Finish him, Kale said quietly. But Elora stepped back. No, she whispered. He isn't our enemy. He's just lost. Kale looked at her, surprised. But he saw it. In that moment, she was right. Thilrex collapsed, unconscious. The noise around him died with a sigh. The chamber grew quiet again. And in that silence, something shifted. Elora looked at Kale, her expression soft. You would have killed him, she said. Her voice wasn't judgmental. Just honest. Kale nodded. I've killed worse. Elora stepped closer. But not today. They stood together in the quiet, the shadows of their past finally confronted. But the future still loomed loud, uncertain, and dangerously alive. The silence in the chamber was thick, almost suffocating. Kale stood over Thilrex, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotion and uncertainty. He'd had many chances to end things, to take control, but something had stopped him. Elora. Elora was different. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Her ability to see beyond the chaos, her calmness in the face of danger, and her deep understanding of the noise had changed everything for him. He had been a soldier for so long, used to the brutal clarity of war. But Elora, she had shown him a different kind of power. The kind that wasn't about destruction. It was about understanding. Healing. But even with her influence, Kale could feel the tension between them. There was something growing, something dangerous, and it wasn't just the noise. It was the desire, the kind of desire that had been buried beneath their battles and their pain. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The way her presence lingered in his mind, the way her touch burned him even through the storm of thoughts in his head. It wasn't just the mission. It was something else. Kale turned to look at Elora, who had stepped away, her back to him, staring at the remnants of the echo core. Her mind seemed distant, lost in thought, but he could still feel her presence. It was like a pulse, a beat that resonated with his own heart. Elora. Kale's voice was low, rough with the weight of what he was about to say. She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders stiffen. He could feel the tension in her. Her emotions were swirling, uncertain. She spoke without facing him, her voice soft but strong. I know what you're thinking. Kale's heart skipped. Do you? Yes, Elora replied, her tone almost sad, as though she knew something he didn't. The connection between us, it's more than just the noise. We both feel it. Kale took a step closer. He was just behind her now, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw him in. Then why don't we do something about it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elora turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, Kale saw the full weight of her emotions, vulnerability and desire mingled with the strength she had always shown. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak at first. It was as if the words were caught in the space between them, suspended by the tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. I've never been in control of my feelings before. I've always been in control of the noise, of the power inside me. But with you, Kale, I don't know how to control it. Kale felt his pulse quicken. Her words hit him harder than he expected. She didn't just fear the noise, she feared the feelings that had grown between them. The very feelings he couldn't escape. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. The warmth of her skin against his fingers sent a spark through him, electric, undeniable. I don't want to control you, Elora, he said, his voice filled with raw emotion. I just want to be with you. Elora's eyes flickered, unsure. The noise that had once been so oppressive now felt like a distant hum, as though they had moved beyond it for this moment, for this truth. I don't know if we're ready for this, Elora said, her voice trembling. I've never wanted anything this much, and that scares me. Kale could feel the weight of her words in his chest. He had always fought for survival, for victory, for control. But with Elora, it was different. This wasn't about survival. This was about something deeper, something raw. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing hers in a gentle, tentative kiss. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't desperate. It was a connection, an understanding, a promise. For the first time, they didn't need words. They didn't need explanations. They needed each other. When they pulled apart, the air between them felt charged with something new. Elora looked up at him, her eyes soft, her breath shallow. I can feel it too, she whispered, her voice trembling. The desire. But I don't know if I can handle it. Kale reached out, pulling her into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. It was slow, steady. And in that moment, he realized that they didn't need to control everything. They just needed to feel it. Elora's voice was a mere whisper as she spoke again. We can't escape this, Kale. The noise, the power, the bond between us. We're too connected now. Kale nodded, brushing a lock of her hair from her face. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice filled with certainty. Together. The world outside their embrace still spun. The battle was far from over. But for now, in this moment, they were safe in each other's arms. The sound of footsteps echoed in the chamber, heavy and deliberate. Kale's instincts flared. He had felt it before, the pressure in the air, the tension that signaled danger. Elora's hand tightened in his, her grip like steel. She was focused, but Kale could feel the resonance between them. She was preparing herself for what was about to come. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and imposing. His armor gleamed with a faint, otherworldly light, the material reflecting the ambient hum of the noise that still filled the temple. Kale's breath hitched. This wasn't just anyone. This was a warrior, someone who had mastered the noise in a way Kale had only begun to understand. Elora's thoughts pulsed in his mind, frantic and sharp. It's him, she thought, her voice edged with fear and recognition. The leader of the resonance. The figure stopped just a few paces away, his eyes locking onto Elora. Kale could see the malice in his gaze, cold, calculating. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to end it all. Illyra. The man's voice was deep, resonant with power. You've made a grave mistake. Kale stepped forward, placing himself firmly between Illyra and the man. No more mistakes, Kale said, his voice low but steady. We're done running. The man laughed, a chilling sound that reverberated through the temple. You don't understand, Kale. You never did. He raised his hand, and the noise seemed to coil around him, an almost physical manifestation of his thoughts, swirling and twisting in the air. You think you can stop this, but you're just pawns in a much larger game. Illyra's pulse quickened, her mind racing with the familiar, terrifying realization, the resonance had always known more than they had ever let on. She had always been the key, the one they had been after, and now it was clear that their entire mission was just a piece in a much larger puzzle. You've only just begun to understand the true nature of the noise, the man continued, stepping closer. It's not just a weapon. It's a force that can reshape the universe itself. And you, Illyra, are the one who will control it. Kale's heart raced. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when Illyra's power would either save them or destroy them all. Don't listen to him, he said urgently, turning to Illyra. You control the noise. It doesn't control you. But Illyra's mind was torn. She could feel the man's influence, the pull of the noise trying to overwhelm her. For the first time, she could see the path ahead clearly. The noise was not just an enemy, it was the key to everything. Illyra took a deep breath, her mind reaching out, her thoughts intertwining with Kale's. Kale. I don't know if I can do this alone. Her voice was quiet but filled with the weight of her fear. The noise is too strong. The core, it's too powerful. Kale turned to face her, his hands gripping her arms gently. You're not alone, he said firmly, his voice filled with raw emotion. We're in this together. We've always been together. The air around them shifted as the man's power grew stronger. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was reality itself bending under the weight of their conflict. Illyra and Kale stood on the edge of a precipice, each step forward leading them closer to an inevitable clash. The man's eyes glowed as the noise surged around him, forming sharp edges like blades of pure thought. You think you can stop me? You can't. You are nothing but a shadow of what I can become. He raised his hand, and the energy of the noise around him condensed into a blinding sphere. Kale lunged forward, his blade drawn, but Illyra held out her hand, stopping him. Wait, she whispered, her voice calm but filled with a new strength. I can control it. We can control it. For a moment, the world stood still. Illyra's mind reached deep into the core of the noise, drawing upon everything she had learned. Kale could feel her power surging stronger, more focused than ever before. She wasn't just fighting the noise. She was mastering it. The man's eyes widened in shock, his power faltering as Illyra's presence overwhelmed him. You can't. He gasped, his voice breaking as the resonance of her mind crushed his. You were supposed to be a tool, not a weapon. Illyra's voice echoed in Kale's mind. We are the weapon, Kale. Her thoughts rang clear, stronger than ever. And we're not going to let anyone use us. With a final burst of energy, Elara's mind unleashed the full force of the noise, consuming the man's power and bending it to her will. His body crumpled, collapsing into the energy he had once controlled. The noise around them dissipated, leaving only the stillness of victory. Kale stood in awe, his heart pounding in his chest. Elara had done it. She had mastered the noise. But in doing so, she had unlocked something more: the power to reshape the very fabric of reality itself. Elara turned to Kale, her eyes soft but filled with the weight of what they had just done. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But now, we have to face what comes next." Kale nodded, his hand finding hers. They had won, but the battle was far from over. The noise was still a part of them, a force they had yet to fully understand. But together, they had proven something to themselves: they were stronger than anything that could come between them. The world around them felt different now. The noise that had once been a chaotic, suffocating presence in Kale's mind had faded, but it wasn't gone. Elara had mastered it, yes, but that mastery came with a price. Kale could feel it: her power was growing, but so was the weight of their connection. They were no longer just two individuals fighting against the noise. They were part of something much bigger, and that thought both comforted and terrified him. Elara stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. They had left the Mind Veil Temple, but the journey was far from over. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, but one thing was clear: they were bound together in a way that neither of them fully understood yet. "You know what this means, don't you?" Elara's voice was quiet, but the weight of her words hit Kale like a wave. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the future. The whole universe." Kale looked at her, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had just done. Elara had reached the noise, controlled it, in a way no one had ever done before. But now, that power wasn't just hers. It was theirs. "I know," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "We can't change what's happened. But we can control what comes next." She nodded slowly, her eyes still distant, lost in thought. "You say that, but..." Her voice trailed off as she looked at him, her expression softening. "How can we? How can we control something that powerful? Something that can reshape everything?" Kale stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. "We do it together, Elara. We've always been in this together." Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Kale could feel the depth of their bond, stronger than the noise, stronger than anything they had ever faced. But there was something in Elara's gaze: a doubt, a hesitation. "Elara?" Kale asked softly, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "Talk to me." She turned away, the weight of her emotions heavy in the air between them. "I'm afraid," she whispered, barely audible. "Afraid of what happens when we truly control it, when we realize just how much power we have." Kale felt a pang in his chest. He understood her fear, but he also knew that they couldn't allow that fear to control them. "We've already come this far. There's no turning back." Elara took a shaky breath, but she didn't pull away from him. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose myself." Kale felt the tenderness in her words, the vulnerability that she had always hidden beneath her strength. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm with certainty. "Neither of us is." For a long moment, they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's embrace, letting the world outside fade away. They had fought so hard to survive, but now, their fight was no longer just about survival. It was about balance, about finding a way to wield their power without losing themselves in it. "I'm scared too," Kale admitted, his voice low. "But I know we can do this. Together." Elora pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something reassurance, maybe, or perhaps something deeper. "Then we'll face it together," she said, her voice stronger now. "We'll face whatever comes next. We'll make our own path." She smiled faintly, though there was a sadness behind her eyes that Kale couldn't ignore. "Even if we have to reshape the entire universe to do it?" Kale smiled back, but there was a heaviness in his heart. They had come so far, but the true challenge was still ahead. There was no telling what the future would bring or how the universe would respond to the power they had unlocked. But one thing was certain, they would face it together. Suddenly, a ripple of energy pulsed through the air. Kale tensed, his instincts immediately on high alert. He could feel it, a disturbance in the air, like the world itself was shaking in response to their newfound power. Elora's eyes widened, her hand gripping his. The ground beneath them began to tremble. It wasn't just the noise, it was something else. Something bigger. From the distance, a low hum began to fill the air. It was a sound Kale had never heard before, but it was unmistakable. A new force was approaching, something far beyond the noise, something ancient. Elora's mind flooded with images, fragments of thoughts, flashes of a coming storm. "We need to go," she said urgently, her voice trembling as the tremors in the earth grew stronger. "Something is coming." Kale didn't need to ask twice. He grabbed Elora's hand, pulling her with him as they sprinted toward the nearest exit of the temple. The sound was getting louder, closer. Just as they reached the exit, the ground split open beneath them. A force, unlike anything they had ever felt, erupted from the depths of the temple. Kale and Elora were thrown back, the force of the blast knocking them to the ground. Everything around them was consumed by a blinding light. When Kale opened his eyes again, everything had changed. The temple was gone, and in its place was a vast, new world. The sky was dark, swirling with energy, and the land stretched out into a void that seemed to go on forever. Kale stood, pulling Elora to her feet. "This isn't the noise," he said, his voice tight. "Something's happened. This is, beyond anything we've known." Elora's mind was racing, the fragments of thoughts coming together like pieces of a puzzle. This is the place the core was drawing its power from. The source. But it's alive. It's more than just an energy. It's a force, an entity. Kale turned to her, fear and awe in his eyes. "If we can control the noise, what happens when we control this?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared future. Elora looked at him, her eyes filled with both determination and uncertainty. "I don't know," she whispered. But we're going to find out. You thought you knew how this was going to end, didn't you? We fought. We won. We survived. But then something happened. The truth was revealed. In the final moments, I looked at Elora, and I realized, everything we fought for, everything we thought we understood wasn't the real battle. The real challenge wasn't defeating the noise, or surviving against impossible odds. It was something deeper. Something darker. What if we were wrong about everything? What if we weren't meant to be together? What if the universe wasn't just testing us, but using us as pawns in a game we didn't even know we were playing? And just like that, the ground beneath us cracked open. A new force, something beyond both of us, rose from the depths. It wasn't something we could fight. It wasn't something we could control. It was beyond us. Beyond love. Beyond the noise. But in that moment, I realized the real question is not what will happen next. The real question is, what are we willing to sacrifice to hold on to this love, even when everything else is falling apart? What happens when love isn't enough? Can we really survive the cost of the unknown, or is that price simply too much to bear? This isn't the end. This is only the beginning. Think about it, what would you sacrifice for love? Could you risk everything, even your own existence? Or is the true answer hidden somewhere far beyond the stars? This is just the first chapter. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe to Intergalactic Hearts, like, comment, and be one of the first 1,000 to experience the adventure before anyone else. The journey has only just begun and you'll want to be part of it. Kale took a step forward, his hand still resting lightly against the invisible barrier. The moment his fingers brushed the shimmering surface, an electric surge ran up his arm, sending a shock of intensity through his body. It felt like his entire being was vibrating with her presence. Her form solidified before him, like a dream taking shape, an alien, yet familiar beauty. Elora's violet eyes locked with his, and in that moment, he felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. There was no need for words. Her thoughts, her feelings, they flooded his mind. He staggered back slightly, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotions. Her fear, her loneliness, her desperation, all of it crashed into him like a tidal wave. But there was something else, too. A sense of hope buried deep within her, like a flicker of light in a darkened room. Please. I need your help. Her voice echoed in his mind again, but this time it was more than just a plea. It was a command, a call to action. Something primal stirred inside him. Kale's heart pounded, and for the first time, the noise in his head began to fade, replaced by the silent plea of this stranger. He clenched his jaw, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. How could he help her? He had no idea what she was or where she came from. But the connection between them was undeniable, as if their minds were somehow inextricably linked. He could feel her presence in every cell of his body. The resonance of her mind was a hum, almost like a song only he could hear. With a determined breath, Kale finally spoke, his voice rough. Who are you? For a moment, she didn't respond. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. It wasn't until her eyes flickered downward that she finally spoke. I am Elora, from the distant world of Tathra. My people, her voice faltered. I'm the last of my kind. Kale's brows furrowed. Your people? What happened to them? Elora took a slow, measured breath, and in that instant, Kale could feel her mind begin to open to him. Her memories flooded into his consciousness, unbidden. Her planet had been ravaged by the same noise that Kale had spent his entire life trying to escape. Tathra, once a peaceful and thriving world, had been torn apart by the chaos of Echo Core, the technology that amplified thoughts, making them reality. And now, Elora was the last living remnant of her civilization, trapped in a world of constantly shifting realities, unable to escape the grip of the noise. I have no place left to go, Kale. Her voice was quieter now, but the weight of her words hit him harder than anything else. She was trapped, just like him. But her prison was far worse. Then why are you here? Kale asked, his mind spinning with the implications of everything he had just learned. Elora's eyes locked onto his once more, the violet depths pulling him in. I need your help because you are the only one who can hear me without becoming lost in the noise. You are immune, Kale. Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible in the heavy silence between them. And together, we can end the noise once and for all. For the first time, Kale truly understood what he had been drawn here to do. This wasn't just about saving a stranger. It was about saving them both and perhaps the entire universe. But before he could respond, the ground beneath him trembled. A sudden shock wave rippled through the air. Elora gasped, and Kale instinctively took a step back, his muscles tensing. Something was coming. A dark figure appeared at the edge of their vision, emerging from the shimmering veil that surrounded them. It was the Resonance, the organization that had been hunting Elora, its agents closing in on her location. Kale's eyes narrowed, the noise returning with a vengeance, filling his head with the thoughts and fears of the approaching soldiers. But Elora was there, holding him steady, her presence a calming force amidst the chaos. The figure stepped forward, a tall man clad in black armor. He raised his hand, and a sword of solidified thoughts materialized from the air, sharp, deadly, and glowing with the light of the Echo Core. We've found you, Elora, the man said, his voice cold and emotionless. Your mind is ours to control. Kale's heart raced. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let him take Elora. Kale's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his energy blade was sheathed. The figure in front of them, cloaked in the dark aura of the Resonance, raised his glowing weapon with a deliberate slowness, eyes locked onto Kale and Elora. You can't stop what's coming, the man said, his voice chillingly calm. I will take her. We will take her, and the noise will end. Elora's eyes widened with fear. Kale felt her panic surge through his mind, sharp like a needle, almost drowning him in the chaos. She didn't want to be taken. She didn't want to go back to them. Kale's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not to her. Not to anyone. The man's sword pulsed with unseen energy, and in that moment, Kale knew they had no time. The noise was building again, louder now, screaming in his mind as the figure prepared to strike. Elora's voice whispered through his thoughts. Kale, you can stop him. You have the power. His hand tightened around the hilt of his blade. He could feel the power surge through him, his superhuman strength, his resilience, his connection to technology. But this wasn't just about strength. This was about something deeper. Kale locked eyes with the man, a surge of determination flooding his chest. With a swift motion, he drew the energy blade. The air around him crackled, charged with the raw power of his will. The first clash was deafening. Kale's blade met the man's sword in an explosion of light and sound, the force of their weapons sending a shock wave through the desert. But Kale didn't falter. He didn't back down. He pushed forward, his muscles straining with the effort, his blade slicing through the air with precision. The resonance agent stumbled back, barely able to keep up with Kale's unpredictable movements. Kale's eyes never left the man. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Elora stood at the edge, watching them both, her heart racing in her chest. Her thoughts were swirling, frantic, afraid. But there was something else too. A spark. A small glimmer of something new. Her mind was beginning to sync with his. Kale could feel it. She was learning how to use the noise. Not as a curse, but as a weapon. Her mind began to push back against the resonance's mental assault. For the first time, Kale could see it. He could feel it. Focus, Elora. Kale's voice echoed through their shared thoughts. His tone was commanding, but filled with hope. Use it. Channel it. We can fight back. The air around them seemed to vibrate, a strange resonance that neither Kale nor the agent could ignore. Elora stepped forward, her eyes glowing brighter, the noise in her mind no longer a burden, but a force that she could control. She raised her hand, and the space between them shimmered. The resonance agent's sword faltered. Elora's mind lashed out, the energy of her thoughts becoming a tangible force, almost visible in the air. A wave of power surged toward the agent, disorienting him. Kale took advantage of the opening. With a swift strike, his blade cut through the agent's defense, and the figure crumpled to the ground, defeated. For a moment, silence fell. The air was thick with tension, but it was a quiet that felt different. The battle wasn't over, but Kale felt a shift. Something had changed. Elora turned to Kale, her eyes wide with astonishment. I did it. I actually did it. Her voice was filled with awe. It wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. Her power wasn't just about surviving. It was about mastering the noise. Kale smiled, though it was a brief, fleeting expression. You did more than that, he said. You saved us. But just as the words left his lips, the ground beneath them shook again. A low rumble, a sound that Kale knew all too well. More were coming. More from the resonance. We need to move, Kale said, pulling Elora to her feet. We can't stay here. They'll send more. With the noise now on their side, their connection grew stronger with every step they took. But with each moment, the weight of their shared mission grew heavier. They were just getting started. And the road ahead was far from easy.